In woodland, nobody digs, nobody ploughs, nobody fertilizes, nobody sprays, nobody's there. Yet it works. We may plough the fields and scatter. We may save the planet by planting trees. But nature doesn't do it that way. Let's work according to nature's methodologies and never overlooking what goes on below ground. If we're to understand how nature works, we must dissect it methodically. Here in our example study, we will consider the workings of woodland and one of its residents, bluebell. Having had a good look at the subject of the project, we ask questions and propose hypotheses which we will test. The question my research had to answer was, we have an idea how the plant-fungus symbiosis mycorrhiza works under highly controlled conditions in the laboratory, but is that how it functions in the field? My research tool was to be the bluebell, but I had first to discover whether or not bluebells formed mycorrhizas. We didn't yet know that. Here are 2 photomicrographs of stained root samples that confirm yes. The project was now on a firm footing. We make observations and gather data, lots, from field sampling and experimentation in the bluebell's habitat and in the laboratory. We analyse and criticise everything to ensure that our hypotheses stand or are refuted. Results are plotted and subjected to rigorous statistical analysis. And we do a lot of thinking before committing results and conclusions to peer review and publication. One quite informal activity happens. It's very creative, but maybe not often recognised as such. Discussion. Our thoughts mature during conversations with other biologists, as here in the rain on the slopes of Benet in Wester Ross, during a previous meeting of minds to consider how to revegetate a severely overgrazed landscape. Here we are discussing mechanical, chemicals-free rhododendron control, a conversation that diverged into considering many aspects of woodland ecology. For me, and probably for others, it was a great experience. I had only 20 minutes for this talk, so I invited delegates to absorb some background beforehand, which I would not have time to cover, by viewing 2 of my 4 YouTube videos about bluebells, symbiosis and mycorrhiza before the meeting. If you already feel out of your depth, please stop and watch them, links in the notes below. With woodland as our model, we will consider ecological complexity, looking in detail at the above and below ground activities of bluebell. Whatever the ecological study, what happens above ground is only half of the terrestrial ecosystem, and ignoring below ground processes is tantamount to bad practice. Here is a very, very brief introduction to the 4 main types of mycorrhizas, followed by a single photograph that shows their occurrences in a British landscape. Categories 5, 6 and 7 are 3 fascinating additional features of these plant-fungus relationships. The brevity and diversity of the topics in this 20-minute presentation illustrates my intention of stimulating intrigue and conversation rather than providing a fully instructional lecture. There's a lot of mycorrhizal diversity in this photo. All of those listed above will be present here. Yet the emergence of complexity from the combination of coexisting simple relationships is not well known outside scientific and philosophical circles. The idea of emergence explains a great deal about how ecosystems function, and they turn out to be mind-bogglingly complicated. The more you know about ecology, the better you know how much you don't know. There is a large oak here, surrounded by its offspring. The oak is ectomycorrhizal, the main tree associating with a whole community of soil fungal species in its roots, the young trees probably nurtured by that system as they mature. Ectomycorrhiza is the only form with easily visible above-ground parts, mushrooms, of which there are many species. Here are examples in which the association of the mushrooms with the host trees may be assumed. If we can find them, ectomycorrhizal roots are characteristically short and stubby, centre. Back to that picture where, if we consider the meadow in the foreground, we can predict that the numerous different resident plants will be arbuscular mycorrhizal, non-mycorrhizal, facultatively mycorrhizal, that is, adaptable to circumstances, or for a few plants, orchid mycorrhizal. Other trees not in the picture will be ectomycorrhizal, such as birch, ash, hazel, while others are arbuscular, such as the hawthorn flowering here and nearby rowan and wild cherry. The hillsides are bright yellow with gorse, an arbuscular species about which there is a full video on this channel. Higher up, where the soil is peaty, ericoid plants grow, heather, bilberry, etc., which have their own specialised mycorrhizal associations with completely different fungi. Other mycorrhizas are also present, though not dominant. Those previous few slides have shown a mere fragment of what is going on ecologically in this picture. So if above and below ground are interlinked, what are the consequences of separating them, as we humans habitually do? Well, what happens if we separate the above and below ground parts of a bluebell? We've established that bluebell is mycorrhizal, so not just the plant is vulnerable, but the fungi too. The bluebells at my single research site turned out to be associated with 11 species. Complexity, you see. Here we go. Every part dead. Maybe some of the fungi will survive a while to colonise the roots of other plants, but the main functional species with bluebell, Scutelospora dipurpurescens, in my experience, probably not. The chop is final. Let's run the animation again. If we chop down a tree, the same applies. Dead, certainly the tree and probably also the fungi. Nature is an ancient reservoir of complexity, so what happens after separation on a landscape scale? Here is mixed woodland recorded on the 1885 Ordnance Survey map, but a small reservoir of species on an inaccessible cliff remains, with 14 woody species representing the lost woodland diversity. Until the mid-20th century, Avenish wood would have been rather like this. Then most of the native trees were felled. This struggling oak by the ancient boundary wall is a sad relic, and Sitka spruce planted all over. Then in 2018, we might well call it just separation of above and below ground. No, it's wanton destruction. So much for biodiversity. So much for Avenish wood. We can also describe it as a simplification of a long-established biodiverse habitat with, well, this is as it was. Next, clear-felled and then smothered with a plantation of Sitka spruce. Here is what that does to plant biodiversity. And then what we have now, the amazing emergence of complexity reversed. Only one of my many videos has received proper attention, nearly 2,000 views, possibly because of its unambiguous subtitle. The link's below. Can we put the woods back together again? Do we truly know what there was there before and how to return it to working order? Complexity. My experience of the science of ecology says not at hope, though we might be able to satisfy some naive ambitions. Such as this, which is called woodland creation, and is happening all over the country. What sort of land is being restored here? After pigs, no above-ground flora remains, and ditto the soil organisms relevant to plant growth. These saplings may put on an initial spurt of growth, but it's likely that many will fizzle out. Scenes of failed woodland creation are everywhere if we care to look with a critical eye. Back to nature. From a viewpoint beside what was once Avenish wood, looking north to the hills above Ochtertyre in Lochaelsh, we can read the landscape to predict its habitats and even its mycorrhizas. An illustration of how nutrient-depleted landscapes might become vegetated are the knolls or hummocks that have intrigued our host Peter Cunningham for years. They are islands of vegetation more complex than their surroundings due to nutrient enrichment and spot inoculation with seeds, spores and so on. These hummocks always occur on high places where they grow higher and become highly visible. Nutrients are brought in by a variety of animal vectors, mammals and birds, choosing promontories upon which to void their bowels. We can consider a little more about these hummocks when we can hazard which mycorrhizas might be at work supporting new vegetation. Fungal propagules can arrive in feces and on feet. I think we can probably read a lot about hummock ecology in the field. This one consists mostly of bilberry, Vaccinium myrtilis, a plant you might expect to thrive on a peat soil hillside, an ericoid mycorrhizal plant. Working their way laboriously into this habitat are arbuscular mycorrhizal trees, rowan, and a grass which has a root system that functions quite well where fungal inoculum might take a while to become established. If we examine a more mature hummock, we can see that its lower slopes are populated with pioneering mosses, which are non-mycorrhizal, and heather, which is again ericoid. That all makes sense in a nutrient-depleted, peat-dominant environment. This hummock has become its own woodland, dominated by a single rowan tree which has been there for a very long time. Will it persist, create conditions for spread of its hummock community, or eventually outgrow its limiting habitat? Compared with Glen Shield we've just looked at, the slopes of Benet are mostly almost bare quartzite, but there are botanical refugia such as this gully which might hold some of the biodiversity necessary to revive this centuries overgrazed landscape. Note the few little trees growing on the adjacent hillside. If they become established, might this little woodland spread, automatically improving the hillside soil and its plant communities? Here we see groups of Scots pines planted in an attempt to speed up the process. A more diverse plant community is becoming established beneath the trees, which will hopefully lead to an improved soil. Note the small trees growing out with the main plot, some doing quite well, others struggling. Perhaps seedlings from the originally planted trees, which will grow up to expand this little patch of woodland. If river catchment vegetation in this region is to be improved, the focus of the meeting, this sort of situation will present conservators with several challenges. Exposed as this burn is, will its vegetation now simply deteriorate, yet another victim of forestry enterprise? Let's talk. I hope aspects of this presentation will provoke questions, conversation, and maybe seed some solutions.